Okay, for the final today, pleased to welcome back Dr. Karen Loomis. Who's going to present something a little bit different to her usual heart analysis stuff? So, Karen.
Great. Thanks very much, everybody, for inviting me back. It's a little bit different this year. Those of you who've heard me speak in previous years, I normally talk about art craftsmanship and construction because that's my area of expertise. So I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone at this talk. But it's a talk that I've been wanting to give for a while, so I'm so happy to have this opportunity. This year's theme is Arthur O'Neill, and I'm sure all of you have been working with Bunting's material, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Boston found Bunting at the British Library, which sounds like, you see the word library and you think, when do I fall asleep? Don't worry, I promise it'll be said, yes.
I know there are some people whose English is the second language here and you're very fast.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. All right. No, thank you for telling me. Okay, and if anybody wants me to stop and answer a question or if I'm not clear, please feel free. This is not meant to be formal where you have to sit there politely and wait for me to finish talking. Okay, Edward Bunting, as we know, first of all, here's Bunting in the tiniest nutshell, right? Born in 1773 in Armagh, in Ireland. He was a musical prodigy. He was really very, very talented. He was trained as a keyboardist, played organ, and when he was, I think, about 19, he was brought in to transcribe music played that was going to be played at the 1792 Belfast meeting of the Harpers. And as I mentioned prior to that, he'd actually been an organist and keyboardist, and he was making a living in Belfast, playing church organ and giving piano lessons to people in Belfast society. So the piano was beginning to be a popular parlor instrument, not the big grand pianos, but actually what's called a square piano, which is sort of table-shaped thing. So something that you could fit in a moderate-sized parlor. But this is him in a nutshell. And this 1792 meeting ended up being a turning point in Edward Bunting's life. And he was so enthralled by the harp music and by the Harpers that he ended up making this his life's work, going out in the field and collecting more music over the next following decades. And in the end, he ended up, over his lifetime, publishing 3 volumes of music based on the tunes that he copied down from the Harpers, and died in 1843 in Dublin. Now, you've probably seen during this week some of the music that's published in Bunting's 3 volumes. He published one in 1796, a second one in 1809, and a third one in 1840. This is a facsimile of the 3 volumes published, bound together. And I think, does the Skull Library have some of the original, Simon? 2. Oh, excellent. So Simon, thanks, Simon. So here are, which 2 are those? Is it?
First 2.
Oh, lovely. Okay.
Central.
Yeah, actually, and later, or that you could, Sam's going to show you.
This is a 1796 reprint. It's not,
Okay.
It's not a true first. Yeah. So here.
Now the thing about this music that he published, and about the Harpers, one of the main points of this festival, the reason it was organized, was not only to preserve, have the opportunity to hear the Harpers gather together and preserve their music, but it was also, there was a broader motive to inspire interest in Irish cultural heritage. This was very early on. It was, considering the politics of the times, was at a time when there was interest in this, and there was an uprising that came very soon after that. What was the year of
1798.
1798? Thank you. Yeah. So really, this was a lead up into that, and there was a desire to kind of raise public awareness in the cultural heritage of Ireland and to help foster a feeling of nationalism. So that was sort of the broader idea behind the Harpers Festival. And in order to get this heritage out to the wider public beyond the festival, you need to get that music out to people. People that weren't there to hear the Harpers. So you have to publish it. But who's going to play this music besides the Harpers themselves? And what are they going to play it on? Not everybody plays the harp. Even in this time, it wasn't something that just anybody played. It was this kind of a specialized thing for professional musicians. But there was an instrument at this time that lots of people were playing, and that was the square piano that I mentioned. It was really becoming very, very popular. And the idea was, well, we're going to publish this music, publish it on something in a way that people can play it. So Bunting went and took his notes from listening to the Harpers, and he arranged the music to be played on pianoforte, what we call pianoforte. And that's what ended up being the published volumes. So it's not quite exactly the same as what he heard. He did some rearranging. Now, if that's all we had from surviving from that time period, just the published volumes, it would still be a really vital and precious source of information on the harping tradition in Ireland at that time. But we're really fortunate that we have more than that. We don't just have the published music arranged for piano. Because I think one of the other themes of this year is women in the harping tradition, and one of those important women is Charlotte Milligan Fox, who in the beginning of the 20th century, she was actually asked by a friend, this is over in England, to help look at harps, to purchase, not pedal harps basically, orchestral harps. A friend of hers had a daughter who was interested in playing the harp. And Charlotte was involved in music at the time, and her friend said, well, can you go help me out? And you're Irish, and you must know about harps, right? And go to this harp store and have a look at the harps and see what you think. So she goes on behalf of her friend, helping her friend out, and just as just making conversation there, and it's a kind of store that sold orchestral pedal harps. Just making conversation. She's looking around, seeing the harps, and she asked the proprietor, I see these kind of harps, but do any of the old Irish harpers, ever come in, to buy, I don't know, parts for their harps or strings or whatever? And he kind of looks at her and he's like, are you serious? They're long dead, they're gone ages ago. about to go out the door. He says, wait a minute. There actually, now that you mention it, there was a man in here just the other week who said his grandfather saved the Irish harp music. And she says, really? Well, who is this? Can you give me his contact information? And so he told her who it was, and it was a man named Louis McRory, who lived not far away. And she contacted him and went and visited him. And she went to his house, and she gets to his house, and basically what he says to her, in a matter of words, is you can picture her coming to his house, and one of the things he says, oh, you're Irish, you're good, because he was Irish too. And he says, I have something to show you. So he takes her in, and he's got a box full of notebooks and stuff. And they're all of Edward Bunting's manuscript notebooks from the years and years that he had spent out in the field copying down the music from the harpers. They had not been seen, since Edward Bunting was alive. And Louis McRory was his grandson and had kept those. And we now still have that collection. And it's not just a couple of notebooks, it's literally over 4,000 pages of manuscript material. That's how much stuff. So it's an absolute gold mine of material. So not only do we don't just have to rely on these published piano arrangements, we have all of Bunting's, well, not all, we have a lot of Bunting's original notes, this huge collection of basically his life's work that can then be sifted through. As you're finding out this week in the classes, it's not a matter of someone just flunking a piece of printed music on the music stand, right? Go ahead, play that, and you're sorted, right? You'll just learn that, and just play what's written down. Yeah, actually, each and every one of you is a detective, and this is detective work. We have to go, kind of pull apart what was going on, get into the minds and the fingers of the harpers during when the tradition was still alive, and try to understand and relive their performance practice and the way their music was arranged and played during the time period. That's what we're trying to do. So that means we need every scrap of information we can find out about them. That's why Bunting's notes, his field notes, are so important. So, well, what did we learn from his notes? We learn a lot about the path between the harper sitting there playing music and this printed piano arrangements. What happened in between those two things? Okay, so field notes. So imagine that you don't have an iPhone that you can, I want to record what this harper's playing so I can listen back. You can't listen back in the 18th century. Luckily, because he was a prodigy, he was able to, basically at speed, make notes very quickly as the harp was. Imagine Siobhan's concert, Siobhan playing her harp, and you're sitting there with blank sheet music paper, and imagine if you had to copy down as Siobhan was playing exactly what she was playing, note for note. This was Bunting's task. Okay, and you can see his process here. Here he's got, this is a first go. So this is Burns March. And I don't know if you can make it out, but you can just see there's just the dots. So you can imagine if maybe Dennis O'Hamsey is playing it at speed, right? And you can just get the dots down so you know the shape, the shape of the tune, and you can see where the notes are. You can see there's some bass notes here. And there's another go. Maybe listen again. So starting to fill it out. You get the note lengths. And here's from Quinn, I think. So So listening to different versions from different harpers, play tunes slightly different ways, have different variations. And these are from different, he had quite a few notebooks, so these are from different notebooks. They're not numbered in any sensible way. The numbering is kind of random. So actually, manuscript 29 is not his 29th notebook, it's actually probably the first one that he started working on. Then he goes back and makes a better copy, copies it over, based on his notes. He's starting to fill it out a little bit more, and he's got more bass in there. And maybe this is a little bit less like what the harper was playing. Maybe he's added in or made little changes. And eventually, he gets to the published arrangement, which is intended to be played on pianoforte, square piano at that time. And here's Burns' March here. Now, we're fortunate to have Bunting's notes. However, I've just shown you we can trace the process, and that's fantastic to be able to do it, because then you can work backwards, right? There are gaps, though. There apparently were more notes, we think, that just don't survive in the collection, even though there's a lot there. There's apparently bits missing. There are some tunes that all we have is the published arrangement. It's not in any of the notes. There are others where we have maybe just the fair copy, but we don't have the rough copy, or vice versa. So it's not 100% complete. And one of the other things we don't have from his manuscript notebooks is sources of tunes for all of the tunes. We have them for some, for quite a few, but there's quite a few important ones and interesting ones that we don't. Well, which harper did Bunting get this from? And that's really very helpful to know. As Simon, I don't know if you've talked about that at all this week, about how the different harpers, some were using fingernails and some weren't. Excellent. And so it matters then. Different harpers were using a different performance technique and were probably different arrangements. So yeah, we'd like to know who did he get that music from? So that's important too. So we want to be able to fill in some of these gaps so that we can answer some questions and better understand the music. Well, up until fairly recently, pretty much all we had, other than the published volumes, was the big collection of Bunting's notebooks, which is now at Queen's University Belfast in the manuscript library. And I think there were one or two little things that had appeared in other places. That's really essentially it. And one more slide I wanted to show you. This is just, let me backtrack a minute. So this was all we had. We had the notebooks that are at Queen's, and we had the printed material. And this is Burns' March again. And you can this is just to recap, you can see this is the rough drafts and the printed one. They're not quite the same. And actually I had, if you want to hear what that sounds like, let's see if I can. I had one of the postgraduate students at the University of Edinburgh. They've got a collection of square pianos from that time period there, when Bunting was active, when he was publishing this stuff. And Bunting actually worked for a Broadwood and Sons, a square piano maker, and Clementi, who was a music publisher. So this was all part of the deal. This was sort of a package deal. So it helped that he was publishing this music for piano. And this is the instrument I was talking about. So this is what's called a square piano or pianoforte. And this one is actually by a Scottish maker, but it's from the right time period. And I had one of the students there play the published version because I want to hear what this sounds like. This is what Bunting intended it to be played on, something exactly like that. I want to hear what it sounds like. So before I play this, I want to say, first of all, she played this she was just sight reading, so it's a little bit rough. So we have to cut her a little bit of slack. So she's just sight reading it. She'd never seen it before, but we want to hear what it sounds like. So you can imagine this is actually what it would be like someone who was learning how to play a square piano and they just bought Bunting's published music and they're looking at it for the first time. And I'll see how this plays. And she went up because she's a pianist, so she thinks up when she's asleep. And that's actually the square piano that it was this exact instrument. So that's the thing that she played it on. You can see it's got one little pedal there. They just introduced pedals to these instruments. So it was like a new innovation. And I can remember her telling me as she's playing that this was being really cranky and she was having a hard time with it. She says it's nothing like the pedals on a modern piano. It's really kind of cranky and you have to really work with it. So, but that's really cool, I think, to hear. That's what Bunting was hearing when he was preparing this for publication. So it's really interesting for us to hear this. Okay, so until recently, this is what we had basically. We had the manuscripts at Queen's and the published work plus one or two bits and bobs. Back in 2009, I was, when I was working on my master's degree, we were given a homework assignment, and the assignment was, we were being taught how to do archival work. And they said, for our assignment was, we just needed to put together a bibliography on any topic in music that we wanted of archival sources for one particular thing. And I thought, oh great, to Edward Bunting, right? I'm set here. I'm done. And so I went and I started to do my work, and I found this. The British Library had recently digitized their catalog and put it online. And what it said was, I'll read it out. Bunting collection, this is at the British Library. Bunting's own copies of his general collection of the ancient music of Ireland, London, 1809, and of his general collection of the ancient Irish music, Dublin, 1796. Those are his first two volumes, including airs ascribed to Carolan and other harpers, bound together and interleaved. So far, so good. With autograph corrections and annotations which often indicate the source of the airs. I had never seen any mention of these before, and I don't think anybody else had either. So I thought, oh, I have to go down. So I got on a train and went down to London. collection. I was like, oh, this is fantastic. I had no idea what I was going to find. It might be just one little thing written on a couple of pages or And fortunately, the lecturer for this course that I was taking said, because I told her I would be doing this, and in fact, she's an Irish musicologist at the University of Edinburgh, and she said to me, take your facsimile copy. This is from like 1969 or whatever. This is some of you have seen this. Take your own facsimile copy with you to the British Library and a pencil. You're not allowed to, at that time at least, no cameras, okay? All you could bring in was a pencil and paper and your own book, if you had a book that you wanted to bring with you. And there was somebody watching you at all times. So I brought, this is my own copy, and I'm so glad I did. So when I got there, it wasn't just, first of all, it wasn't just one little thing written. Here's Burns March again, just to give you an idea. Just about every single page, so it's just the first two volumes, 1796 and 1809, bound together, the printed ones, just about every single page has stuff written on it, crammed into every margin. And we're, this couple hundred pages of new information of Bunting. This was absolutely fantastic. So what I did was I requested a scanned copy from the British Library, which I brought today, for you guys to look at. So it's all in here, but also, and also I'll point out later, I'll explain in a minute why I was so glad that I brought my own copy, because what my lecturer said, you take your copy and your pencil, and you've got the British Library copy, the original with the original manuscript notes in it, and you go to the same page in your copy and you write down exactly, word for word, whatever, on the same page in your facsimile. That way when you go back, you've got it all in exactly the same place. Rather than trying to take a note that says, oh, it was on this page or this folio, and you just put it right in your facsimile. It was fantastic. And you'll see why that was so important. But let's look at this first. So here we are back at Burns March, but with lots of extra added stuff. I don't know if you can see up here. Well, here, there we go. Okay, so up at the top, I know you can't read that, so I printed it here. It says, one of the first tunes taught to the young harpers, and one of the first in which grace notes appear. That's what it says up here. And look underneath here, there's handwritten music staff, and I don't know if you can see them, but there's two of the graces have been written out. There's the little stream, and I don't know if you can make this one out. I forget the name of this one. It's the two notes. It's and what's that one called?
Grisha?
It might be a Grisha, yeah. And up at the top right, from Hempson. And you can see there's all this stuff written in the bottom margin. And that says, this melody is very ancient, being composed without the intervals of fourth and seventh. Many different sets of the air are current in Ireland. It is said to have been composed for the Burnses, who were lords of the marshes or papes near Newry in the 13th century. See the peerage and get an anecdote of them. Many songs were adapted to this tune, one of which is Did You See the Black Road? So we've got some background information here as well as a little bit of commentary and a source for the tune. So Hempson would be Dennis O'Hampson. Now, there's evidence, and there's very good evidence in the manuscript, or in the annotated copy that I'm showing up here, that these are Bunting's own notes. That this isn't somebody later on going back and filling stuff in. And I'll show you the evidence that strongly points to this is actually genuine stuff. One of the things I wanted to do was, okay, so I went back to the same student. I said, can you play this? And there's a reason why, because you can't see it here, but here. Changes to the music. That's just so cool. So the music has been changed. So this is all on the bass line here, and I'll show you some more on some of the other tunes. And but here it's more subtle because it's just some changes in the bass line. And I asked her, I had her play it, and I asked her what she thought of the two versions, being a keyboard player, and her opinion was that it looked like he was maybe trying to make it a little bit easier for somebody who was, not a professional pianist to kind of play the bass line. He was maybe making the bass line just a little bit easier to play. So this is not necessarily more original information from Harper's or harp arrangements, at least for this tune, that maybe this was Bunting going back years later and said, well, let's just tinker with the piano arrangement a little bit. But let's hear what it sounds like. And again, it's a very subtle difference, but we'll listen to it. Played on the square piano. I think that's really cool. This is really exciting. This is unpublished information on Bunting's arrangements of this music. So this is really exciting. This, by the way, is from the 1809 volume. Well, okay. So it's not just Burns March. There's other interesting. Here's another one that will be familiar to you. Some of you anyway, Carolyn's Concerto. And here's the published version from 1809. It's also in the 1796. It's a slightly different arrangement. This is the 1809 arrangement, and this is what's published. Here's the annotated copy, and I've highlighted changes here, and also there's an interleave, that is an extra piece of paper has been inserted in between the pages of the printed volume, and it's been written on. So unfortunately I don't have a recording of this one. I kind of wish I had done that, but Carolyn's Concerto is the one that goes and actually what we're interested in is the second part, which goes sorry, I'm not a very good singer, but you get the idea, and it goes down, 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 that's how it ends. But look, there's been changes, and you can see the measures have been numbered, and what has been done here is the little repeats have been taken out. So instead of going dun 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 dun, it goes dun 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 dun, and then you go over here, and instead of a run of notes, there's an arpeggio. So instead of going dun 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 dun, dun it goes dun 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 dun. I'm not quite sure why it ends on the C, unless it wants to lead back into the beginning. Maybe that's just sort of a lead in. So that's really interesting. Again, this is a late change. This is obviously after 1809 has been published. Yes, go ahead.
I don't think it's a C. I think it's a rest.
Oh, that would make much more sense. Okay. Sure, that could be a rest. Yeah, all right, thank you. I like that better than a C. Love it. Okay, great. Okay, got that sorted out. Good. Okay, so this is a later change. This is, after this was published. Now, I'll talk about, in a little bit, well, why is he doing this, right? If it is Bunting doing this, and we think it is, why? It's already been published, but we'll get to that. Oh, also, again, it says this is from Fanning. So that's really interesting. And I'll talk a little bit more about who he sources the different tunes to, who the different harpers. And this one down below, which is Love Be Near Me, it says Quinn harp. This is his harp Fanning. I noticed going through these that some of them he writes down harp next to them. And I assume that means this is from a harper as opposed to from a singer or, some other kind of thing, fiddle or whatever. So he's actually, it looks like, saying specifically, this is a harp tune. This is from a harp tune. This one says Quinn harp down here. And also, this says once seventh. In other words, what he's saying is that the scale of the tune is missing the seventh of the scale, missing T.
Excuse me, Karen,
Yeah.
it says harp Fanning.
Yes, harp.
And nothing else there? And below harp Quinn, nothing else?
Right.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah. So this is a later change, but Bunting was one of the last people to hear Carolyn's concerto played while the historical tradition of harping was still alive. And so it's really interesting to see his take on it. Here's another one, we've got, just to show you, it wasn't just a couple of pages. It's like this almost all the way through. This is fantastic. And this one says harp, Linden, which is Patrick Linden. This is Mild Mabel O'Kelly in the top here. And you can see there's a bunch of stuff that's been written in between and underneath. And the words written in between the notes say, this tune presents the anomaly of being in D natural minor while the harp was tuned in high bass key or key of C natural, the fourth tone from C, F, being left out all through. This method of tuning and arrangement of key, these D minor, happening very often. So he's commenting on the music. I think, and you people in the room can help me out here, looking at this tune, I think it's in Dorian, and that's actually what he was seeing it as D minor, but I think it's actually a Dorian tune.
But that's what he means by the natural D minor,
Yeah.
classical. It's sort of the folk D minor, which is modal.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And even in the tune underneath, this is any Galway people here. He says this one's called the Fisherman. He says it's a Galway tune. So there you go. No, quite. Yeah, it doesn't say harp there. So, and so underneath Mild Mabel O'Kelly, this bit here, it says, this tune was much esteemed by the harpers. It is very wild and from its construction so different from others of Carolyn's that we must attribute it to some of the harpers prior to his time, O'Cahane, Scott, or one of the Conlons. And he has other things to say about Carolyn, actually. And it's really quite interesting because there are comments about Carolyn sort of peppered through here. And I wanted to read one out to you. Oh, it's in the other one. Here it is. I'm going to read this one out. And here's where I was really glad that I brought my facsimile, because this was on a page, it was written in very faint pencil. And there was quite a bit of stuff here and there, written in pencil or very faint pencil. There were things that were erased that just did not show up on the scan. And if I hadn't been copying down every single thing, it would have been lost. I wouldn't have gotten it. So this was written in really faint pencil on one of the pages. My opinion of Carolyn is that he has a good ear for music, and it is remarkable how he, beginning the harp at 16 years of age, could have composed those airs called Planksties, which he, is said, seems to have been the inventor of, as well as all the other tunes similar to Colonel O'Hara, because at that age, 16 years, the mind and habits are mostly fixed, and it is well known that persons who endeavor to learn music nowadays seldom attain any perfection after this period of life, and it would appear to be more necessary to begin music early to attain that perfection in execution. He's capitalized and underlined execution, by the way, on the instruments chosen than any of the other arts or sciences. But Carolyn did not compose any of his airs in the Irish manner, except one, Bridget Cruz, which doubt being his, to whom he was attached. This air, in my first volume, 1796, is so unlike his other melodies that I suspect the air is pure Old Irish. Carolyn made words for all those melodies that go by his name, and he's crossed out as author to confirm, which give occasion to the harpers of the succeeding generation to attribute both music and words to him. This has led to the mistake, and he put in parentheses, mentioned here his, and I couldn't make it out, something illegible, called Port Athol in Scotch books and Makua, illegible, tune in Burke Thumah book, 1725. Carolyn's celebrity might have been owing in a something, to the patronage of the lady who, something, harped and who watched over him, something, so many years, so that circumstances alone he may be, something, thought so. Reminiscent over all this controversy, his music, in the shape is like Irish, has no resemblance or features like it. So this was really great to see this. And again, and notice he mentions this air in my first volume, 1796. So it's written in the first person. So I really do, this is one of the things that makes me think that this is actually Funky's notes and not somebody else's. So I thought this is fantastic, and it's really interesting to get a little bit of insight in here. This is unpublished stuff. To what Bunting thought of Carolyn, and it looks like he thought Carolyn was too newfangled. You know, he was a bit modern and Italian, and not really in the style of the ancient Irish music. It's very interesting to see his words on this. There's a couple of more tunes, and there's a reason I wanted to point these out to you. Hewlett's Health, it says, author and date unknown, from an old man whilst thatching a house in Sligo, 1792. Now, this is not a harp tune, but the reason I've included this in here is because So there are these 2 volumes, and some of you may be aware that in the 1920s and 30s, Donald O'Sullivan published versions of Bunting's music annotated with Donald O'Sullivan's annotations and notes, sort of his own annotated versions in the Folk Song Society of Journal of the Irish Folk Song Society. And this is a really important source, and the reason I'm mentioning this here is because it looks like, going through in all the annotations, it looks like Donald O'Sullivan had seen this annotated 1796 volume that's bound together with the 1809. So he'd seen one of these 2 volumes. He mentions that there's another tune that's in 1796 that has this very similar annotation under it, from an old man whilst thatching a house in Sligo, 1792. Probably was the same one. And Donald O'Sullivan mentions that for that other tune, and he also mentions some of these annotations that I saw written into the 1796 copy that aren't anywhere else. And interestingly, Colette Maloney, when she put together her fantastic volume that shows, it indexed everything that's in Bunting's notebooks and all the other sources, she saw Donald O'Sullivan's work and couldn't figure out where he was getting this information from for the 1796 volume tunes. And she even says it in her book. I have no idea.
Sorry, Carol, you have to stop and say that Colette's here. So if you want to talk about
Yeah,
stuff, she's right there.
Oh, hi, I didn't see you back there. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, so reading your book, I could see that I would be puzzled too, because Donald O'Sullivan doesn't really say, he's not very specific about where he gets these annotations. He just kind of includes them in there. And somewhere kind of buried in there, he says, oh, this came from Bunting's own copy of his 1796 volume. But then it's really not obvious, which one. Is it the one because there's a copy at Queen's? So was it that one? He doesn't say. So, yes, it must have been a puzzle, for some of this, where was he getting this? Because it wasn't in the notebooks necessarily, some of it. And when I looked at the copy of 1796 that's at the British Library, you could see it was word for word in a lot of places in Donald O'Sullivan's versions that he'd annotated. So he'd seen one of these, but it looks like he hadn't seen the 1809. He'd only seen 1796, so there's a mystery here. They're bound together. They must not have been bound together at that time. And also at that time, it looks like the 1796 annotated version was at Queen's. So he mentions that. And somehow or other, and maybe you know, I don't know, I'm hoping you can shed some light on this because I have no idea, they somehow ended up together at the British Library. And when I looked at these, there was a note inside the binding that said that they had been rebound to, I think it was in the 1930s, around 1938, which was probably not long after he finished doing his research. So I don't know, it's a mystery, and I don't know, can you shed some light on what was going on?
I can shed a bit more light in that they were originally in the British Museum. And right around when I started doing the work in Bunting in 1995, they're actually catalogued in the British Museum was lying when we were there. But the British Museum lost them. And at some stage, just after 2000, but they didn't actually physically lost them.
But they couldn't find them yet.
It's when the new British Library opened, where it was the fantastic building it is in the early, not too sure, but during the year 2000 as well, so slightly after. The British Museum gave all their manuscripts to the British Library, and in the transition, they bumped in 2 copies, plus there's a handwritten manuscript as well, partly contemporary with manuscript 30 and manuscript 27, it's incorporation of 1840. They were then catalogued when we found them, so I would have seen them probably about 2003, I'd say 2004 was the first time I actually saw them. And we found them just after the book was published. We always knew there was manuscripts in the British Museum, but they could never be found.
They couldn't find them for you, yeah.
And I saw a reference to the acquisitions being that they came from Louis McRory about 1935.
Okay, great.
I don't know if that's still in existence or not, but there was also single off-prints where some tunes, songs and literature from the 1809 had been sold as separate song sheets. And they're in the British Library as well.
Oh, interesting. Oh, yeah. Well, I know that the 1809 that's at the British Library, on the first page inside the front cover, it says Louis McRory, and it looks like it's a signature. So maybe that's where they got that from.
Yeah, I think I saw an acquisition for it was in about guessing now offhand, but I think it was 1935. I have to know something.
Okay. Oh, all right. So do you think that they were ever at Queen's, or do you think they went straight to the
Actually, I mean, I suppose with other collectors, the family sometimes value the published books, and there's several other collectors where the family would have just thrown away the manuscripts as bits of paper and would have prized their published possessions. So when he gave the manuscripts originally, he may have kept those, or he may have found them later. And it's hard to know, it's definitely Bunting writing, but it's Bunting writing not when he was in the time of 1843, which he's writing that very shaky and that's.
Yeah, that was great. So that's helpful because that was something I was going to talk about a little bit. Is this Bunting's handwriting, or is it, as you mentioned, Colette has? If you haven't seen her book, I assume there's a copy here. It's fantastic. This made my work doable. I mean, incredibly much easier. There's this catalog. It shows every single source, all the notebooks. It's a tremendous help if you want to know where a tune is in one of the manuscript notebooks and cross-reference it. It's all in there. And one of the things Colette mentions is is it true there's some different handwriting styles in some of the manuscript notebooks and so was Bunting using scribes or secretaries or something like that, do you think?
Well, he used 2 scribes in particular, but he had correspondence. So he invited people to send him material. And a lot of what survives, apart from manuscript 29 and 33-1, is some of the later material. I think most of what's missing is some of his earlier material, earlier manuscripts.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of the correspondence survive, as does by his 2 Patrick Lynch. He's got language material in there that all survives, and James Colby survives as well. They would be 1800 onwards. But a lot of it must be a lot of the earlier material is missing.
So it's nice that we have this then. Okay, so thank you. That solves a lot of that mystery. So on the bottom half of this page, and again, this is another page from 1809. We've got Planxty Irwin. It says harp tune from Higgins, and it says Carolan from Thady Connellan in 1792, composed for Irwin of Streamston House. Now, if you look closely, you can kind of see it looks like there's stuff's been erased down here. And actually, in this case, it was just what's written here in ink. There were a lot of places that looked like there was pencil notations that were then copied over in ink, and then the pencil was erased. But there's other places where there was pencil that was erased, and it was different stuff. There's an interleave facing Planxty Irwin, and there's notes written on there, and it says, here it says, the Planxty was not always in 6/8 time, several of them being in simple common time. And underneath it says, Carolan does not appear to have been the inventor of this sort of melody, as one piece called Planxty Davis claims the date prior to Carolan's composition. So again, but if you look closely, there's stuff written in here. And it was pencil that had been erased. And it actually, in the middle there, it says, several being in simple common time, it appears the tune was called Planxty, from being danced on planks of wood. Which is really interesting. I have no idea if that's actually the case, and it's quite possible that Bunting decided, oh, that's nutty, and that's why he erased it. I don't know. But it's really interesting because I don't know if there's, I don't know if anybody knows, is there a source for the word Planxty? No.
Yeah, people suggest various things, but it's one of them.
There's no clear etymology.
Oh, okay. All right. So, okay, well, this can add to the mystery. So I thought that was really interesting to see that. So it's nice to see this little tidbits in here. Yes, I think this is the last one. So here's just one more. Because this is Arthur O'Neill week, I wanted to slip in an Arthur O'Neill tune. Again, he says, Harp O'Neill up here, and we assume this is Arthur O'Neill. Grace Nugent with revisions here. And I've highlighted this. So you can see several revisions done here. And I don't have this tune in my head. I've actually listened to it recently. Does anyone know Grace Nugent? You can comment a little bit for us. I think it's a da-da-da. Oh, I can't do it now. Dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun. It's that one.
This is the reason why everyone has to learn sight singing.
Yeah.
Is that not the one where I was-
Yeah, so this part, the second part here goes da 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 da. And again, here's another case where there's an interleave. So this section's just been crossed out and rewritten here. So some more sort of stronger chords in here, and you can actually. So this is the kind of thing where somebody who likes to do some analysis of music, of Irish harp music, this would be your great project. There's so much more that could be done with this. I'm just showing you a few little tidbit highlights. Okay, what about the sources? So what I did was I just very quickly made a list. There's 2 pages to this table of any page in both of those volumes where it's been written in a name of a harper next to a tune. I've made a list here. And this is a draft, so there might be, I might miss something out. So I apologize if there's some mistakes in here. And then I went back and I looked at Colette's book, thank you, Colette, and I looked to see which ones were either attributed to other people in the manuscripts or not attributed to anybody or attributed to the same person. So I sort of cross-checked it a little bit, and I highlighted. So the ones that are highlighted in red, and again, this is just a rough draft, so I may have missed something out or missed out a source, so I apologize if this isn't 100% correct. So this is a draft. The ones that are in red, I don't think there's any named source for that tune elsewhere, either in the manuscripts or anything published. The ones that are in gray are already named elsewhere, for example, in the manuscripts. And if it's a different, so for example, the Greenwoods of Trua, in the manuscripts, that's attributed to Dennis O'Hampsey and Arthur O'Neill. So it's not the same everywhere. And I don't know if it's because these are tunes that were gotten from more than one person, or he's misremembering, or I don't know. So there are places where the attribution is different from information from the manuscript notebooks or from other sources. But it's a lot of stuff. And a lot of this column is the 1796, so I think a lot of this is in Donald O'Sullivan. A lot of this information, I think. But this is nowhere else, so this is great. And here's some of our favorite harbors, and then we get to the next page. And again, here's the next set, and I've highlighted. So this is fantastic information if you're really interested in studying the playing and the arrangements of a particular harper. For example, look at all of these tunes attributed to Rose Mooney. And now that there's a Rose Mooney harp, you can actually, isn't that great? So this is assuming these attributions are genuine. You know, they are. And again, there's a couple that are attributed to Rose Mooney, but elsewhere in Bunting's manuscript notes it says Hempson. So, you know. And again, there's a whole bunch of Arthur O'Neill tunes. So this is great stuff. And well, we just had a discussion about the handwriting, so that's fantastic. But just to add to that, I mentioned that it's unlikely that it was someone much later going back and adding this stuff in, because it had to have been someone that had access to information that's only in the Bunting manuscripts, that's not published elsewhere. And also had information that's not in the surviving Bunting manuscripts or in publication. And also, the handwriting, it's an older style handwriting. English roundhand style, one of the features of it is the letter D kind of curls over. I don't know if you see that in some old manuscripts. So it has some archaic attributes in the handwriting. One of those is the long S, and I'll show you. So by long S, in words that have a double S, like this is the word bass, as in tuned in high bass key. Notice how the first S, it almost looks like a letter F. And that's an example of the long S, and that fell out of use in the mid-19th century. So it's highly unlikely that this was someone later than, say, 1850 doing this. Another thing, on one of the pages where there's erased stuff, I don't know if you can you make that out? It looks like a letter B.
Look, there's an E there.
And this is from the first page of manuscript 29, EB. So it's possible.
By the way, Karen, somewhere at the University of Edinburgh, there's annotations in one of the books or manuscripts, and they refer to a gentleman, E.B., and I've often wondered if it was Edward Bunting in there. All I know is that it was music that was put out in display, like in cases.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I saw E.B. there, and so I don't know where you really to look, but if you ever, it's there somewhere.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Yeah, so, I don't, Colette, you might want to, do you think that this is Bunting's actual handwriting, or do you think it's somebody writing like a...
I would have had it closer when I was over and definitely I would say it's Bunting.
Great. Oh, super. Yay. Oh, and again, we just talked about the different handwriting styles and the self-reference. Okay, so what's the point of doing this? They've already been published. Why would he do this? His first volume, the 1796, was actually pirated by other printers. And back in the day where, copyright law was not what it is today, and for published music in particular, I think there wasn't, I'm trying to remember if there was even copyright law at that time for published music. I don't recall, but it certainly was not like it is today. And basically a printer could just go out, buy a copy, I'm sure this is what they did, buy a copy of Bunting 1796, saying, this is great, and then go have their own printing plates made, change the font a little bit or whatever, and sell just basically note for note the same thing, just on their own binding, and they get 100% of the profits for themselves. And this happened in spades for Bunting 1796. He actually didn't get much money off of printing that because it had been pirated so many times. It's like today when somebody goes and pirates music or a movie and then puts it up on the internet for people to download, torrent or whatever. It's the same idea. And this happened to Bunting. If you've looked at the published volumes, you may have noticed that the 1796, there's just a very short preface, written preface, and then it's just then the music. So it's not much of an introduction, it's just a little bit. And in the 1809, a little bit longer introduction. And the 1840 is quite substantial. He has a lot of written material that's really quite useful. So his third volume contains a lot more descriptive background information on harbors and music than the first two volumes. So you can see, if you get into his mind, you could think, maybe he wanted to have another go with these first two volumes, reprint them, republish them, revised editions, with expanded introductions, with all sorts of extra background information and commentary on the music that wasn't there the first time you published them. And imagine if you're Bunting, you might go back to your notebooks and start pulling out information on these tunes to add in to new published volumes. Another good reason would be Thomas Moore. So you may have heard of Moore's Irish Melodies. And what happened there was, and here's just very romantic. I love this. This isn't that great. This is from one of the early editions of Moore's Irish Melodies. So basically, what he did was, after Bunting's volumes were published, after his first two were published, Moore went through and, I can't remember the name of his music arranger. It's in my paper here. But he basically took Bunting's published music and rearranged it, made new arrangements, and published it as Moore's Irish Melodies, which was hugely successful. Very, very successful. And Bunting did not like this one bit, as you can imagine. And I think in Charlotte Milken Fox's book, there's some letters from Bunting where he talks about this. But he basically doesn't like the fact that he feels that his work has been stolen and republished, and he also doesn't like the arrangements that were made. He feels that they were really kind of destroying the music, and that they were just terrible arrangements. I think he said something like it was like the damage done to my music, or I'll have to look it up later, but yeah, he has some choice words for Thomas Moore. So there was no love lost between these two men. And one thing that Moore didn't have was all of this background information that Bunting had collected in the field. Moore could copy the notes and rearrange them and publish music, but he didn't have all that other extra stuff. Only Bunting had that in his notebooks. And this may have been Bunting's way of, hey, I got this, I can republish these volumes with all of this extra information. There's no way Moore has that. So, okay, work to be done. So if somebody's looking for a project, this would be a great master's degree project or whatever. I've really just touched upon a few things, and this is outside of my area of expertise, so if somebody wants to do this, great. Catalog all the annotations and cross-check them, and somebody who would really like to look at the revisions to music, there's other revisions you can have a look afterwards. There's lots of commentary on O'Carolan. We can cross out the last one. We can cross it out. That's done. But anyway, thank you, and thank you, Colette, because I mean it. If it hadn't been for that massive volume of cross-reference information, I would have been lost. It would have taken up 10 times longer for me to make that table of, okay, which tunes went with which harper and which ones we don't know. So, and also thank you to, Eleanor was the person who very gamely played that cranky old square piano. So thank you, Eleanor, and thank you, Simon. And Elaine Kelly is the person who said, take your own copy with you. And I have it here today. So what I brought for you today, look into the references, is, and please feel free to come up and have a look at both of these. So this is just the standard reprint that has all 3 volumes together. And so the 1840 doesn't have anything, because this was just 1809 and 1796. And by the way, there was, I can't remember where it is, but I have it in my notes. It looks like these annotations were made not too long before Bunting passed away. And I think there was some reference somewhere in the annotations, I don't remember where, that kind of pointed to this being very, very late in his life. So it looks like, he was intending to do this and he wasn't able to finish it. He passed away before it was completed, which is a shame. But we have this, so that's fantastic. But do look through. I've even put in interleaves, and they're all taped in, so don't worry about them falling out. As you can see, there's all this stuff, and I'll leave this out for people to look at. Don't worry about the tattered cover. That's fine. And this is the scanned copy from British Library. So I brought these for you guys to look at. And yes, any questions?
Yeah, just a comment about that revised version of the Carlin Future. When you take out those bits and cross out, it's actually more like the popular version
Is it?
of the tunes. So it might actually be a case for the oral tradition
Oh.
as actually being more accurate than.
Oh, that's a really, I don't know if the rest of you heard that. That's a really good point. I had no idea.
Because sometimes you talk about people, if it's not done on paper, it doesn't matter. But sometimes your oral tradition can actually, I don't know, it's just as hard. That's something.
No, that's great. I had no idea. That's really interesting.
Because I am familiar with the popular version of